wonderful to be back here in Lincoln, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces today. I'm just astounded and impressed by this fabulous facility. When I was here as a student, as probably some of you know, we were working out of a little closet, and it's just a whole other world, and I congratulate the entire community for making it happen. I also thank Dr. Cruz and the Visiting Scholar Selection Committee for bringing me here. I'm having a very productive stay. I've been doing a lot of research, been in the archives the past couple weeks, and I'm so excited I get to come over here to the museum this week and start looking at quilts. And everyone has just made this stay so enjoyable, so thank you very much. You'll note that this presentation today is not directly about quilts. Rather, it is about how designs on popular objects, including quilts, are spread, and how the same design influences are part of larger cultural trends that influence architecture, interior design, painting, and mass-produced consumer goods. As I'm sure many of you know as a result of attending International Quilt Study Center exhibits over the years, quilts and other home-produced objects do not exist solely in the minds of the individuals who make them. They are objects that reflect the culture in which they were created. In this presentation, I'll trace some of the reasons that designs based on those of the Pennsylvania Germans gained resonance during the 1930s and 40s, and how these designs were disseminated and what these processes mean. First of all, a couple of definitions. What is Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania German? Both terms popularly refer to a regional folk group, the German-speaking Protestant and sectarian people who primarily and initially emigrated to southeastern Pennsylvania during the mid-18th century. The term itself is a little tricky, as Dutch might imply that they're from Holland, but the Pennsylvania Dutch are in fact descendants of German-speaking immigrants from Germany and Switzerland and surrounding areas who settled in Pennsylvania prior to 1800. One common explanation for this trickiness in the terms is that the German word for German is Deutsch, or sometimes said Deutsch in the Low German or Southern German. And so likely the term Dutch, Pennsylvania Dutch, is derived from this Deutsch. The Pennsylvania German culture flourished outside of Pennsylvania as well, in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, in parts of Ontario, and pockets in the Midwest, including areas here in Nebraska, west of Lincoln, that were settled by Mennonites. By the 1930s, few Americans of Pennsylvania German descent continued their folk ways, including the use of the Pennsylvania German dialect, and even fewer Pennsylvania German artisans continued to create furniture and woven coverlets and pottery and other folk arts that they were known for. The Amish today are often equated with Pennsylvania Dutch. They're one of the remaining members of this ethnic group that live distinctly and recognizably from the rest of society. In this presentation, I'll use the terms Pennsylvania German and Pennsylvania Dutch interchangeably. During the 1930s and 40s, the period I'm discussing, the Pennsylvania Dutch was the more popular term. Next, what is Pennsylvania German design? Here are a few examples of the aesthetic from the late 18th century and 19th century. You see lots of surface decoration, cheery motifs, birds, tulips, whirligigs. And because these designs are applied as surface decoration through the means of paint, in the case of the furniture, or glaze with the ceramics, or embroidery stitches, these same designs appear over and over in different media. Up here, this is an example of fraktur, which is an illuminated manuscript technique. It's done with ink and watercolors and often has calligraphic writing along with it. So these are all very typical of what we call Pennsylvania German folk art. Pennsylvania Germans began making quilts relatively late compared to many of their Quaker and English neighbors. They used woven coverlets and feather ticks well into the 19th century. Here's an example of what this probably looked like. But by the late 19th century, Pennsylvania Germans were prolific quilt makers. Here we see a couple examples of Pennsylvania German quilts, both from the late 19th century. In these examples, you see the bright colors again, lots of ornamentation. The applique quilt, which is the pinkish one, bears a more direct resemblance to the motifs we saw on the other media, on the furniture and the ceramics. And the piece quilt on the left shares the same playful sense of cheeriness, but doesn't have the figurative elements that we see in the applique. So now, with this aesthetic in mind, let's proceed to look at how and why Pennsylvania German design became so fashionable in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. In 1942, the upscale New York City department store, Bonwit Teller, marketed a Pennsylvania German-inspired beer set, available in the colors Amish green or Copen blue, that consumers could embrace as, quote, both modern and primitive. The beer set's bright colors and country charm contrasted with Bonwit's well-heeled customers' usual preference for high-styled European and streamlined modern designs. Yet the presence of such a product reflects the struggle many Americans felt as they negotiated the machine-age progress of contemporary culture. During the 30s and 40s, some Americans recognized that Pennsylvania German folk art's traditional symbols, such as the heart and tulip, could fit into their contemporary fashions while expressing a traditional sentiment. From 1935 through 1955, the cheery hearts, flowers, and birds ubiquitous in Pennsylvania German folk art became what House and Garden magazine called, quote, a new American design source that impacted upscale settings like Bonwit Teller, as well as everyday objects such as linoleum placemats, note cards, and patchwork quilts. One writer, observing the abundance of such products, even declared, "It's fashionable to be Pennsylvania Dutch today." In the decades leading up to the Great Depression, some Americans expressed ambivalence to the industrialized, commercialized, urbanized culture in which they now lived. This nostalgic modernism did not reject ideas of progress outright, but longingly looked back to the past in search of an antidote for the anxieties of modern life. Artists and cultural critics influential in the art world also turned to this folk past in search of something usable. They issued proclamations urging their peers to turn to folk art as an inspiration for contemporary design. In the 1920s, Colonial Revival projects, including Henry Ford's Greenfield Village outside of Detroit and John Rockefeller's Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, were established, and that also helped reinvigorate public interest in America's past as well as American homespun design. A distinct variety of this cultivated interest in America's traditions was the newfound appreciation for Pennsylvania German folk arts, visible on the antique market, in museum galleries, and in the drawings created as part of the Federal Art Project's Index of American Design. Following the lead of early collectors, artists and designers embraced Pennsylvania German folk art as a design resource, eventually resulting in the widespread interpretation and commercialization of this aesthetic. Yet this widespread recreation of Pennsylvania German folk art occurred through fundamentally modern institutions and forces, which celebrated the traditional anti-modern character of the folk art. Despite the seeming paradox, the rhetoric surrounding this design inspiration, coming from journalists, artists, curators, and advertisers, explained how these traditional designs could in fact fit into modern life. The ubiquitous surface decoration applied to Pennsylvania German folk art made it both visually unique as well as easily reproducible. These are all 20th century examples, where the earlier slide we showed were the originals, the 18th and 19th century examples of Pennsylvania German art. The brightly colored birds, tulips, and heart motifs found on those old chests, ceramics, and fraktur reappeared on genuine Armstrong's line-a-wall placemats in the early 1940s, and here we see it on playing cards, recipe boxes, and mass-produced stoneware. Like decals, the motifs could provide surface decoration to a variety of forms, both the Pennsylvania German craftsmen of the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as these 20th century reinterpreters of the folk art, mixed and matched the motifs, creating cheerful compositions of birds, stars, hearts, and unicorns. Interest in Pennsylvania German folk art first emerged as a regional collecting interest. In the early 20th century, a few private collectors latched onto this regional style and began to search for antiques made and used by this ethnic group. In the span of 5 years, 2 of the nation's most prominent art museums installed permanent exhibits of Pennsylvania German rooms. The Philadelphia Museum of Art installed rooms from a Pennsylvania German miller's home in 1929, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art followed with an installation of the De Forest collection of Pennsylvania German art in 1934. Other elite collectors, including Henry Francis DuPont and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, also paid ample attention to this material culture and amassed important collections during the 20s. The curator at the Met praised this aesthetic, noting that, quote, "The distinction of these arts and crafts lies in the strong sense of design possessed by the Pennsylvania German pioneers, who, aided by a lively imagination and love of robust color, evolved their own vernacular for self-expression," end quote. Coinciding with such praise from curators and wealthy antiques collectors was the attention modernist artists began paying to folk art in general. Inspired in part by European counterparts, such as the Fauvists, who drew on exotic objects for their artwork, such as this painting by Henri Matisse. You can see the folk art influence on the wall treatment and on the tablecloth as well, and just with these bright, cheery colors. The American modernists began acquiring American, quote, primitives, which were hooked rugs and weather vanes and decoys. One artist and industrial designer identified the, quote, artistic confusion of the machine age as an impetus leading her and other artists to turn to these primitive sources, such as basketry and pottery, for inspiration in her artwork. Perhaps the advocate of such sources with the loudest voice was Halldor Cahill, a well-connected art critic and curator in New York's art scene. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Cahill curated some of the first museum folk art exhibitions hosted by the Newark Museum and the Museum of Modern Art. He soon translated his curatorial interest in folk art into rhetoric of inspiration for artists and designers. Writing for a variety of audiences, he called not only for equal appreciation of folk art on the level of fine art, but also for its use as a, quote, source of vitality and renewal for our own day, end quote. Of Pennsylvania German folk art in particular, Cahill later wrote, quote, "In their feeling for surface and their stimulating influence upon our all but lost sense of vivid and clear color in articles of everyday use, they have much of value for the contemporary designer and the craftsman," end quote. Sharing this belief in folk art's value for contemporary design, Ramona Havitz, who headed the New York Public Library's picture collection, concluded that the United States government should fund a series of publications, or an index, illustrating American folk arts. Through her work at the library, she recognized that artists and designers had high demand for, yet inadequate access to, such sources. She discussed this idea with artists who imagined how such a project might fit into the newly developed Federal Art Project, a program of the New Deal's Works Progress Administration, or WPA, that aimed to provide work relief to unemployed artists during the Great Depression. In late 1935, the Federal Art Project initiated its Index of American Design, upon the approval of its newly appointed director, none other than folk art enthusiast Halldor Cahill, who already was actively promoting folk art as a design resource. The project, a governmentally funded modern institution, complete with multiple levels of bureaucracy, sent unemployed artists to museums and private collections to create detailed watercolor renderings of folk, popular, and decorative arts, that would form a visual archive for use by artists and designers. This photo shows one of the artists painstakingly working on a watercolor reproduction of a quilt top. In addition to creating an index, the project also spread these design sources through numerous exhibitions during the 30s and 40s, and even more publications that continued later into the 20th century. The results of these watercolor renderings, in my opinion, are remarkable works of art in and of themselves. Here are a couple details of watercolors of quilts from the Index of American Design. You thought the photography studio here in this museum was impressive. What if you had artists painting each of the several thousand quilts here? Organizers of the Index of American Design highlighted Pennsylvania German folk art along with the Shaker arts and the folk art of the Spanish Southwest as one of the most, quote, original expressions of American creativity. The Pennsylvania project of the Index of American Design was particularly successful in part due to the leadership and continuing dissemination of Pennsylvania German folk art aesthetic by the Index's supervisor, Francis Lichten. Lichten, a Pennsylvania, keep in mind these are watercolors, these are not the actual objects. Lichten, a Pennsylvania native, enrolled as a teenager in the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art, studying design and interior decoration. After working for years as a commercial artist, from 1936 to 1941, she served as the Pennsylvania State Supervisor for the Index of American Design. In this position, she discovered her love of the folk art from her home state. As an artist and designer, she too saw the value in the aesthetic for contemporary use and encouraged others to adapt it to, quote, to our own uses, add new charm to possessions, and beautify our surroundings. Through her work on the Index and through her own publications, Lichten played a key role in the dissemination of the Pennsylvania Dutch aesthetic. For example, Lichten selected illustrations to use in a portfolio of silkscreen reproductions of watercolor renderings of Pennsylvania German objects that Index organizers distributed to libraries, schools, and to private homes. Following her stint as state supervisor, Lichten published 2 illustrated books that drew on her accumulated knowledge and sketches from her work. The second of these books, Folk Art Motifs of Pennsylvania, presented the illustrations in clip art form, with the motifs divorced from the objects that they once decorated. The book's publicity materials suggested that the, quote, 181 designs and decorative motifs may be traced directly and freely reproduced. A reviewer commented on the book's utility to the do-it-yourselfer. Immediately usable. How about tulips growing out of an urn? In this way, these motifs served as decals that contemporary artists and home crafters could easily apply to various forms. And they did just that. Sharing a studio with Francis Lichten was her companion, Katherine Milhouse. Like Lichten, Pennsylvania's federal art project employed Milhouse. Milhouse created a series of Works Progress Administration posters inspired by Pennsylvania German design, promoting local tourism, another modern institution that sparked additional interest in all things Pennsylvania Dutch. Her posters featured stylized Amish figures along with numerous depictions of Pennsylvania German motifs, blending folk art with contemporary art. Here's a few more of her posters. I'm a really big fan of these. Milhouse further disseminated this design through publication of several children's books with Pennsylvania German themes and illustrations, including The Egg Tree, which received added fame by winning the 1951 Caldecott Award for Best Illustration in a Children's Book. Another contemporary artist, Richard Peter Hoffman, also drew on traditional Pennsylvania German motifs in his abstract artwork. Trained in commercial art at Parsons School of Design in New York City, in the late 1940s, Hoffman realized that his surroundings in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, were full of source material for his abstract art. Of his adaptations of familiar Pennsylvania German folk art themes, he said, quote, "As our great-grandfathers used hearts, flowers, stars, and birds in the stylistic form of their age, so an artist today may interpret these same motifs in modern abstract form," end quote. The reviewer of his art in the Pennsylvania Dutchman, which was a regional magazine devoted to Pennsylvania Dutch folk culture, commented on the, quote, nostalgic sentiments conveyed by Hoffman's paintings. Hoffman's adaptation of the light-hearted motifs of his region's folk art perhaps made his abstract art more accessible to those familiar and comfortable with traditional symbols, thereby bridging the chasm between tradition and modernity. I'm particularly fond of his abstract art interpretations of quilting motifs. And keep in mind, this is several decades before New York's abstract artists supposedly discovered the graphic power of pieced quilts. This relatively small-time artist from Lehigh County, Pennsylvania, was perhaps way ahead of his time. Other artistic endeavors utilize modern structures to further expose the public to Pennsylvania German folk art, but in contrast to Hoffman's abstractions, retained the traditional element of craftsmanship. Mildred Davis Kaiser, a psychiatrist and amateur potter living with her husband, a Pennsylvania German native, on their farm outside Philadelphia, began offering workshops on creating Pennsylvania German-inspired pottery in the late 1930s. Unlike some of these other artists I've mentioned, Lichtenstein, Milhouse, and Hoffman, Kaiser was not a trained artist. She developed her skills and enthusiasm for folk art while working in an art therapy clinic, teaching crafts to so-called nervous patients. She also solicited enthusiasts and experts in additional crafts, including weaving, wood carving, pewter, and quilt making, to publish a series of 26 home craft courses. These slim booklets provided instructions for the do-it-yourselfer to hop on this craft revival and create an array of Pennsylvania German projects for the home. These home craft courses, written by experts, providing instructions for creating one's own pieces of original folk art, exemplify another modern means through which Pennsylvania German folk art disseminated. In 1942, Woman's Day magazine suggested additional ways for home crafters to utilize Pennsylvania German motifs. The magazine published images from the Index of American Design, many of which were of Pennsylvania German objects. Project ideas accompanied the images. For example, alongside a ceramic plate was a sketch of a hand towel with the suggestion, quote, 2 of the birds from the lower edge of the plate can be borrowed as a decoration for guest towels and embroidered in the outline stitch. Similarly, the article proposed adapting the potted tulip motif from a late 18th century painted chest to create an appliqued wall hanging. Perhaps this article inspired some crafty readers, including quilt makers, to create their own adaptations of Pennsylvania German folk art. If quilt makers needed additional inspiration, it was readily available. One of the widely read books about quilt making from the mid-20th century is Margaret Ickey's The Standard Book of Quilt Making and Collecting, published in 1949, which my grandmother, a prolific quilt maker of Pennsylvania German descent, was nice enough to pass on to me. Ickey's offered, quote, modern interpretations of Pennsylvania Dutch designs on several of her quilt patterns, including this one, which she says is well suited for a room with dark, plain woodwork. Here's a couple more she suggests her readers may want to make, featuring the ubiquitous birds and tulips of hallmarks of modern interpretations of Pennsylvania German design. You'll recognize these as quite similar to the designs Frances Lichten promoted through her work on the Index of American Design. While I don't know of examples that followed Miss Ickey's patterns explicitly, quilts do exist that were likely inspired by the Pennsylvania German design trend. I've selected several from the International Quilt Study Center's extensive collection that, based on visual evidence and when they were likely made, suggest to me that they are part of the Pennsylvania German design revival. We see tulips here. Let's see. There it is. Which I think, with the tulip and all these bright colors, perhaps was drawing on Pennsylvania Dutch design. We also have whirligigs. And let's not forget the birds. Again, based on visual evidence, I assume that these patterns were created from, or these quilts were created from patterns or kits that were commercially produced. So it might be the patterns that were actually inspired by the Pennsylvania Dutch rather than the quilts themselves, but I don't believe any of these are directly traced to specific patterns at this point. Mountain Mist, the batting company, which famously distributed quilt patterns with each roll of batting, published a couple of Pennsylvania Dutch patterns supposedly inspired by hex signs, the colorful barn decorations tourists seek out in the Pennsylvania Dutch country, including Daddy Hex and Pennsylvania Dutch. When you visit the exhibition gallery featuring a selection of quilts made by the Mountain Mist patterns, you'll see one of the batting wrappers that actually is promoting the Daddy Hex pattern. For the others less artistically inclined, many additional adaptations of Pennsylvania German folk art were readily available on the commercial market. Margarita Mergentheim, a textile designer, created some of these Pennsylvania German-inspired products available to consumers. As a 1939 newspaper story reported, quote, "Miss Mergentheim is responsible for many of our most sophisticated linens, kitchen and guest towels, and tablecloths." After discovering the beauty of the dower chests and the frock-tours available in the Lancaster County countryside, Mergentheim began transferring these motifs to a variety of home textiles, some of which were available at the upscale furniture and rug store W&J Sloan, as well as at Saks Fifth Avenue, and at Wanamaker's, a major Philadelphia department store. The reporter of this newspaper article made the astute observation that, quote, "Strangely enough, this early art has a distinctly modern feeling." Indeed, while Mergentheim and other artists acknowledged the, quote, "primitive source of their designs," advertisers and retailers assured consumers that the Pennsylvania German aesthetic could blend right into modern homes and lifestyles. This commercialization of Pennsylvania German folk art style through such sources as department stores and interior design magazines further illustrates the symbiotic relationship of modern structures and traditional design. Everyday objects, often decorated with motifs perhaps derived from such sources as Lichtenstein's Folk Art Motifs of Pennsylvania, filled the marketplace. House and Garden magazine, a monthly publication showcasing, quote, "imaginative decoration, authoritative trends in entertaining, architecture, and building," quote, end quote, promoted Pennsylvania German-inspired housewares available at major department stores in the early 1940s, with descriptive copy combining adjectives such as modern and provincial. Stern Brothers advertised Pennsylvania Dutch wallpaper in a perky red and blue flower pattern for $1.50 a roll. Other retailers offered hand-painted reproductions of dower chests made with, quote, "traditional craftsmanship," featuring decorative unicorns, hearts, and tulips. These and countless other examples of commercially available Pennsylvania German style suggest that dissemination of such design sources was in fact effective. Although consumer appeal is much harder to gauge than product availability through sources such as interior design magazines, these advertisements indicate that these Pennsylvania German-inspired housewares were readily obtainable by consumers looking for a cheery antidote to the anxieties of modern life. Yet the very forms of industrialization that contributed to some of these anxieties also mass-produced the goods consumers bought to alleviate this unease. For example, Yorkcraft, Inc., purported in 1955 to be the, quote, "largest single commercial venture using the Pennsylvania Dutch theme, operated out of a 2-story factory." In addition to an extensive sales force, Yorkcraft employed 2 trained commercial artists who designed the company's 40 different products, which included numerous paper goods as well as cutting boards and painted tins. Yorkcraft, based in southeastern Pennsylvania, claimed to print 2 million Christmas cards a year and do business in, quote, "all parts of the United States, plus Alaska, Hawaii, the Canal Zone, Canada, and Bermuda." Even as consumers embraced the plain and fancy themes of Pennsylvania German design as authentic remnants from the past, factories mass-produced such goods and utilized sophisticated systems to distribute their products on a large scale. In addition to such mass-produced housewares, House and Garden featured contemporary architecture purported to be after the Pennsylvania Dutch. In 1940, the magazine published the floor plan for a California architect's new West Los Angeles home. While the image of the home's exterior reads as any spacious suburban home, the magazine copy emphasized the home's distinctive features, which included a kitchen with both, quote, efficient modern equipment and, quote, a charming aura of old-time largesse. The plans emphasized modern, easy, and formal living, yet underscored the seemingly traditional Pennsylvania Dutch details, such as the dark stone created from a mix of light-colored native rock and old tombstones. 4 years later, House & Garden reported on the recreation of a Pennsylvania farmhouse in Illinois, complete with a spacious living room, sleeping porch, and attached garage. Both accounts celebrated the Pennsylvania German countryside origins of such architecture, yet these old-fashioned sources did little to disguise the modern amenities, floor plans, and neighborhoods in which these homes were built. This veiling of modern structures, in this example suburban homes, with the trimmings of Pennsylvania German design, must have offered some sort of comfort to Americans living during the 1940s. In many ways, these modern entities, such as the Index of American Design, the Home Craft Course series, and the Pennsylvania German installation at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, sought to disguise their modern qualities with a Pennsylvania German facade. The champions of this design aesthetic could affix tulips to anything, placemats, architecture, abstract art, and label it as an authentic piece of folk tradition. Advertisers frequently used the adjective authentic to describe various Pennsylvania German-inspired goods. One could purchase authentic Pennsylvania Dutch recipe fractures, authentic trivets, and even authentic decals of hex signs. Think about that for a second. The adjective likely signaled much more than simply genuine goods to consumers, as surely they must have suspected that decals of hex signs were in fact not the genuine article. The idea of authenticity could make modern life much more palatable to consumers, who may have feared losing the stability of a traditional past as they encountered machine-age streamlining. Papering one's breakfast nook with cheery Pennsylvania Dutch wallpaper, as Stern Brothers suggested in their advertisement, could allow a homeowner with specialized modern spaces such as nooks to retain a traditional ambiance despite such modern amenities. Similarly, an early 1940s whiskey advertisement featured a Pennsylvania German-style dower chest complete with unicorn and hex sign decorations. In this gentleman's den, the chest served as a bar and liquor cabinet, accentuating how this traditional piece could fit right into a modern domestic setting. In these sites, tradition and modernity did not exist as binary opposites. Rather, they formed a sort of nostalgic modernism in which these ideologies symbiotically reinforced one another. The old Reading Brewery recognized this connection, and in a very self-aware advertisement, offered a perhaps timely examination of the term Pennsylvania Dutch, listing many of the material associations conveyed by the label, including dower chests, red barns, and skilled craftsmanship. The ad concluded, quote, "The words Pennsylvania Dutch encompass a wealth of history and tradition," end quote. Consumers, artists, and folk art collectors all recognize this meaning as well. In a sense, these Pennsylvania Dutch accoutrements were a symbolic means of domesticating modern spaces and practices. Yet these designs had more than a symbolic connection to modern life. Only through distinctly modern institutions and practices, museum exhibitions, the Federal Art Project, design courses, antique collecting, department store shopping, and cultural appropriation itself could these symbols of tradition disseminate into the modern world. Thank you so much for your attention.